Can you hear me now?
Oh, that's much better.
I was thanking Ruben. He helped put me in touch with the Swedenborg Scientific Association to publish the book, and he was kind enough to read the book. That's itself a wonderful thing, and also review it, and helped write a work for back of it, so thank you. So my topic is the influence of Swedenborg on osteopathy, and I don't expect to cover 150 years of history of the science of the osteopathic movement, cover 12 different people, Swedenborg's ideas, osteopathic ideas, and do all that in 30 minutes. But what I'd like to do is to be like a stone skipping across water, to touch on a bunch of different topics, to pique your interest, and I'll be glad to answer questions as well. So I'm going to throw a bunch of ideas out at you, and I thought I'd start off with something that impressed me. I'm going to tell you about osteopathic medicine, what it is, tell you about a little bit of Swedenborg's ideas in terms of health, how the body works, anatomy, physiology, and these are from his scientific works as well as from his theological works. And also how they one influence the other, how he influenced the osteopathic movement. Osteopathic medical school is a 4-year curriculum, and then you do residency afterwards. Usually it's 3 years depending on your specialty. So my first year I was sitting in school in Chicago, and I came across a quote that from Dr. Still. They had a little lecture in the history of the movement. Now the school is all about teaching anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, pharmacology, and then clinical sciences. So they didn't spend a lot of time on history and philosophy. They had a lot of work to get done. But the little bit they did, myself having grown up in a Swedenborgian background, I love philosophy and history. So I gleaned on it right away. You see some quotes from Dr. Still, who was the founder of the osteopathic movement. And a couple of quotes here. After all our explorations, we have decided that man is triune when complete. First, there is the material body. Second, the spiritual being. Third, the being of mind, which is far superior to all vital motions and material forms, whose duty is to wisely manage this great engine of life. Now, we think about osteopathic manipulative medicine as a hands-on approach. It's integrated into a greater paradigm of patient care. But here's a founder talking about mind, body, spirit as a single entity. That's pretty interesting. And the way he used his words, it's not the same as Swedenborg, but it made me think it sounds kind of Swedenborgian. I'd like to explore that. So I tried reading some of his works and quickly stopped because they're written back in the late 1800s. Swedenborg's hard to read, so is A.T. Still. He did write English, but it doesn't flow real smoothly. His ideas are fantastic and very meaningful. As a first-year medical student, I put it down. Second year, I'm happy back, put it down. Third year, I remember thinking, put it down. It wasn't until I was out in practice for several years and decided to embark on another project that involved writing a thesis for a program that I wanted to graduate that I chose to touch on this topic again, and actually read all of Still's works, and then I'm reading a whole bunch of Swedenborg's works, and it came out to be this topic which turned into a book. So that's how I started on this journey. Still's hard to nail down. He quotes here's his sources. I quote no authors, but God and experience. You won't hear him saying, I like Swedenborg, I read Arcana Celestia, I read The Economy of the Animal Kingdom. However, he was influenced, and there's enough evidence that I wrote a book about it, as well as some influence on some of his students that developed osteopathy further in certain aspects, like the cranial field. So what is osteopathy and osteopathic medicine? I'm going to touch on that. And two people in particular, the founder, Dr. Andrew Still, one of his students who developed the paradigm further in a direction known as osteopathy in the cranial field. That's William Garner Sutherland. I'm going to touch on some of Swedenborg's ideas, both scientific and theological, in particular with human structure, function, health, and disease, and then show how one influenced the other. So, what is osteopathy? Osteopathy is now known as osteopathic medicine. Back in the day, it was called osteopathy. It's evolved over time. The man who started it was Andrew Taylor Still. He flung the banner of osteopathy to the breeze in 1874. That's the words he used. He was a frontier doctor, the son of a Methodist minister who rode the circuit, fire and brimstone kind of guy, who also practiced medicine. And back then, medicine was done often in an apprentice fashion. One person learned from another. It was not always a degree specialty. So he was a frontier doctor, and he left heroic medicine of the day, and I'll tell you more about that. He started a new approach to medicine, and it had a guiding philosophy that distinguished him from existing medicine of the day. That's very important, and new applications he developed from that. He was born in Virginia, and back then Virginia was a very different place, 1828. As I mentioned, he was the son of Abram Still, a circuit riding Methodist preacher who also practiced. His mother, Martha Still, wanted an education for her children, even though they lived in the country. It's very important to her. So they moved around a few times and moved, eventually landing in Missouri in 1837. tensions grew over the issue of slavery at that time. His father was an abolitionist, very opposed to slavery. He saw it as an affront to God and to Christianity. However, there were Methodists who were pro-slavery, and there was quite a few of them. So there's a lot of division within the Methodist Church over that. So they had to move because of that. They actually moved to Kansas, and I'm kind of jumping over a few things to just get to the meat of the matter, but basically he ended up doing farm work as well as teaching. And at the age of 20, married his first wife, Mary Margaret Vaughn, who would later die and he would remarry. They moved to Kansas in 1852. His father worked at a mission for the Wakarusa Shawnee, and Andrew still finished teaching and followed a year later with his wife and 2 children. So he ends up in Kansas in the 1850s, and that's where he really diverged from the practice of medicine of his day. That's important for many reasons. Medicine of the day was known as heroic medicine. Heroic medicine, by our standards, seems ghastly. It was conventional medicine and had been for a long time. Heroic medicine was the orthodox medicine early and middle 1800s. It was practiced by regular physicians. If you didn't practice regular medicine, you were an irregular, and you're often looked at as an outsider and criticized. But realize back then, there was very little organized medicine. In fact, there was very little organized anything. You had military system intact, you had a government that was developing, you had maybe organized religion in terms of mainline movements, but otherwise, things were not like they are today. There wasn't much that was highly structured. Heroic medicine did not have a guiding philosophy behind it, other than the concept that the body might be out of balance with its environment. It was very vague. It sort of descended from the idea of humors, and there was no specific cause for disease, just an imbalance, and so they didn't have germ theory. They didn't have a clear idea of the circulatory, respiratory systems the way we do. So it's hard to think how they thought back then. We take so much for granted. Some of the treatments they had at that time included therapeutic bleeding. They would often induce vomiting and diarrhea. They would purge patients. It was done a lot. They felt if you were sick, heroic medicine for the day involved purging, and they give you medicines to induce vomiting and diarrhea, sometimes sweating and blistering. One of the medicines that was used a lot when Andrew Taylor Still was a young physician was calomel. Calomel was something he loved to talk about. It's a mercury-containing compound that would irritate the lining of the gastrointestinal tract and cause diarrhea. If you had many doses over time or a single high dose, it was actually very toxic. It made you lose your teeth. It stopped the growth area of the teeth. So he claimed that he had wooden teeth due to calomel. He despised calomel because he came to leave behind a lot of drugs of the day. Something happened politically that was important. So he's in Kansas. He's a young physician practicing heroic medicine with his father as well as farming. In 1853, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And when that happened, that said by popular sovereignty, the territories of Nebraska and Kansas could decide if they were free states or slave states. And at that time, America was very much balanced between pro-slave and anti-slavery forces. And so new states coming into the country could really tip the balance of power significantly. So this was very important to the rest of the country, what happened in these states. So in Kansas, when this act was passed, immediately things started changing on the ground. A lot of pro-slavery forces came in from Missouri, from southern area, to establish towns to declare themselves as residents and be pro-slavery when it came time to vote. And in response to that, the New England Immigrant Aid Company arose. And that was from New England, New York area, and further north of New England. And that was some entrepreneurs that tied together social causes with business opportunities. So they helped fund a lot of people from the Northeast to move there, to set up towns, to have farms, to be anti-slavery abolitionists, and also to set up hotels and be able to later sell that land at a profit. So it was a mixed motive, clear from the front. These people that came from the Northeast were very different than the frontier people. These people were involved in popular movements of the day. They challenged the concept of heroic medicine and still found himself surrounded by these people, starting to question what he was seeing. So he continued to practice, but he was asking lots of questions. In 1874, he left organized medicine. He also left organized religion at the same time. He moved to Missouri, where he eventually set up practice in Kirksville, Missouri, where the first school would later be set up. He practiced a drugless type of medicine. He did not use drugs in his day because those drugs were based on heroic medicine. There was no thought behind a mechanism of how it works. It was rather, you're sick, we'll purge you. The calomel is a good example of that. He, over time, coalesced his approach into a philosophically consistent approach that was very distinct from mainstream medicine. It included hands-on treatment adjustments, he called them. This is before chiropractic. And he named this osteopathy. He did well. His practice flourished. It did so well that people started traveling from across the country. He set up a school in 1892 in an effort to teach other people how to do this. He had the opportunity to grant an MD degree. He chose not to. He felt like this approach was something different. He tried to teach this in the existing system, and they laughed at him. They said, you're not using drugs, go away. So he set up his own school and did it his own way. So he graduated, he offered a degree, Doctor of Osteopathy. I wish he had a better name, because osteopathy is not the best name to describe what he was really thinking, but it's the name we have. He set up this program. More osteopathic medical schools followed. In fact, they flourished. Quite a few followed. His idea was to be a full licensed physician who practiced all areas of medicine, including delivering babies, doing surgery, but to do it from an osteopathic perspective. So I haven't really told you what that is yet. I'm just giving you some historical background. He tried to introduce this osteopathic approach, as I mentioned, into the existing system. Some of the differences between his approach and his medicine of the day, and realize the medicine of the day is very different than medicine of this current time. He emphasized a holistic approach. He looked at the person as the focus, and he rejected the toxic drugs of that time. And he did a hands-on approach that now is called osteopathic manipulative medicine, which is a creepy name for something really wonderful, called osteopathic adjustments. Some people in my profession don't like that because it sounds chiropractic, which is a different profession, but still call them that, so I call them that. So I do osteopathic adjustments. The idea being to work with the body to help itself. There's an inherent ability for the body to heal. The role of the physician is to facilitate that process, which is there already, not to try to identify disease and remove it. So it's a different approach. And he applied this throughout all areas of his practice. He talked about, we focus on the body, but that body is the house of a mind and a spirit. This is not spirit healing. He didn't do spiritual things. He did hands-on things, but in the context of mind, body, spirit, which is very different than heroic medicine of his day. Some of the tenets of modern osteopathic medicine, which derive from Still's time. The body's a unit, the person's a unit of body, mind, and spirit. You'll find this online now. This is the current profession. The body's capable of self-regulation and self-healing with an inherent ability to heal itself. Structure and function are reciprocally interrelated. That almost sounds sweet origin. Some strange things you don't have great meaning, you're not sure what they mean. But the idea of the structure of something determines its function, and its function depends on the structure, and the two are very interrelated. It sounds abstract, but you start looking at muscles, bones, nerves, arteries, lymphatic drainage, you start to see the structure and function. That's a very powerful statement. It's based on rational treatment. Rational treatment is based upon understanding these basic principles of the body: unity, self-regulation, interrelationship of structure and function. So osteopathic medicine flourished. It's a great alternative to conventional medicine because if nothing else, it wasn't doing the harm that some of the heroic medicine was doing. Now, heroic medicine changed. Conventional medicine started to not use such toxic things. By the early 1900s, it was improving too. But at that time, many schools developed. I went to Chicago College of Osteopathic Medicine, and I was very proud that they started the year 1900. I thought, that's great. I got schools in history, some continuity, techniques that have been practiced for over a century. Make a long story short, I ended up practicing in Alabama for 15 years, because they have a saying, you don't move where your wife wants to the first time, you will the next. And my wife said she wanted to move to Alabama. And I said, okay, I'll do it the first time. So we didn't have any conflicts. We practiced in a small town, did family medicine with lots of osteopathic manipulative medicine integrated into that setting. She grew up in Chicago, in the West Side, tough neighborhood. And she said, I like your education. I said, well, I think I have a good education. It had some holes in it along the way, but try to make up for it. No, you grew up in a culture of education that values things, ideas that you have no idea because you grew up in it. I grew up outside of it. She grew up in Al Capone's old neighborhood, bodies on dumpsters, other things I won't tell you about, but it wasn't a great neighborhood. So she said, I'd like that for my kids. Let's have them go to school in Bernathen. I said, well, they're kind of rigid in the high school when I went there, and I don't know, but the college was great. And she said, we're going. So we moved here so our kids could start high school. Been here 4 years. My oldest is graduating, and we love it. The high school is wonderful, very happy here. And so we moved here because we liked the idea of education. And how to get in that tangent, I don't know. But anyhow, because now I'm at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine, and they were founded in 1899, so they're a year ahead of my alma mater. Probably I'm frustrated at that. So I practice out there at the University of Miami. So during the 20th century, osteopathic and allopathic medicine converged quite a bit. The idea of treating the patient, of using non-toxic therapy, of inherent healing, Those are ideas you'll find in some streams of modern medicine. You'll also find streams reminding a lot of heroic medicine too. I mean, it's a very mixed bag. But osteopathic medicine today, all students are taught the first 2 years of medical school, osteopathic manipulative diagnosis and treatment. But not all of them use it when they're out in practice. And it's a real shame because they all have a foundation in it. Many of them don't use it. So if you see a DO, doctor of osteopathy, it might be a family doc, it might be a surgeon like my wife. They're all fully licensed physicians. They can go to any specialty, some of which do a lot of osteopathic adjustments, some do a little bit, friends and family, some don't do any at all. So just because they have DO at the end of the name doesn't mean they're practicing Dr. Still's osteopathy. Some do, some don't. Somebody knows. It's a wide variety out there. There's over 70,000 DOs in practice. A lot go into primary care, family medicine, internal medicine, pediatrics, OB-GYN. But very few specialize in osteopathic manipulative medicine because the idea was it should be integrated throughout medicine. However, that has over time become a subspecialty, and that's actually what I'm doing now. There's over 30 schools. They're growing like mushrooms. They're actually growing too fast, I think, but that's a whole other topic. There's over 20,000 osteopathic medical students in school, plus in residency. So it's large and it's growing, but it's not as well known as MDs. So what's this have to do with Swedenborg? I mean, I've talked a lot already about heroic medicine, AT Still. Swedenborg's ideas had a significant impact on Still, but they haven't been recognized until recently. And they had even greater impact on one of his students, William Garner Sutherland, who developed osteopathy in the cranial field. I'll talk about them both. So thank you, Ruben. You did a great job going through setting the stage for all the scientific works in Swedenborg's transition and then as a theologian. And when I first started, I grew up exposed to Swedenborg's theological ideas. And I studied lots of other ideas and religions and really found value when I came back to study this more. I never picked up his scientific works. I just wasn't exposed to them. And I went to new church schools. Those books, I even had a copy of the Cerebrum that I got at a discount on my shelf for about 5 or 8 years before I ever actually opened it up and started reading it. So it's really fascinating to read his scientific works, particularly as someone with an interest in medicine, to go back and look. They're brilliant. They're not easy to read, but they're really interesting works. Swedenborg was on a mission to find spiritual and natural aspects of reality, starting with the material world, which he really has studied in the Principia, and Ruben can tell you much more about that than I can. But he realized the human form is the highest form, most likely where spiritual and natural interact. I need to study human anatomy to find out where's the seat of the soul in the body. If there's a spiritual, natural, parallel realities, and we live in both simultaneously, then there must be a way for that to happen. What's the mechanism? How does the soul manifest in the body? So he studied with all the great anatomists of Europe. He didn't just stay in Sweden. He traveled many times, and he wrote many books. The two that he published were originally called The Autonomy of the Animal Kingdom, now The Soul's Domain. Is that correct? Dynamics of the Soul's Domain. And then The Animal Kingdom is the Soul's Domain. So you've heard a lot about those books already. I won't go into the details. He also wrote some books he didn't publish. He wrote one on the brain called The Cerebrum, and he wasn't happy with it. He said, I went too fast. I need to go back and do it again. So he wrote another long treatise that's later been published as The Brain. And in that is a lot of very detailed anatomic and physiologic studies that have great interest to my study. He had some ideas that may sound familiar to you in those books. He talks about a concept of 3 discrete degrees, correspondence and influx, body, mind, and soul being an example of that correspondence. He talks about an underlying uniting force that interconnects the body, and that's the presence of the soul. This is in scientific works, so it's a continuum. There's a discrete difference. I'm not suggesting these have theological value. My point is, just to reinforce what Ruben said, this is someone who's on a journey, and these ideas developed, a lot of them in a scientific study, particularly on anatomy and physiology, which would then be included and refined and expanded in his theological works. In his scientific works, Swedenborg recognized that the brain is the link between the soul and the rest of the body. He talked about the soul as being the sphere or the degrees of ends or purposes. The brain is the sphere or degrees of causes or means by which these can be carried out, and the body is the effect or the final ultimate degree. Sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? But that's in the scientific works. Kind of interesting that was there. So in his scientific works, he presents a model of the body as being very intricately connected through many means, through a fascial continuity, a fluid aspect, as a single continuity of soul-body interaction. It doesn't have the sophistication of his theological works. He's searching for that, like Ruben said, from the ground up, trying to find it from looking upwards from anatomy up towards higher ideas. He talked about a concept that I found really very interesting. He talked about the brain as having inherent movement. The brain has an expansion and contractile properties to it that can expand, contract, and it's part of a greater mechanism that had some other factors in it that animated the human body. He looked at the human form as the crowning achievement of God's creation, created in the image of the divine human. And he talked about, so these are now ideas I'm drawing from all of his works. The harmonious correspondence between soul and body, the body serving as a matrix for the life force of the spirit, uniting through motion necessary for life, the spirit clothed in the body. So that's more of his theological writings, but you can see how it's a refinement and improvement on some ideas that were brewing in the scientific thinking. He talked about co-established harmony in his scientific works, different organ systems of the body working in harmonious variety that forms the entire person. All these organ systems doing their own things, but yet there's a uniting harmony within them. And there's a universal connection throughout the body, and that's done, he gets down to the anatomy of it. He says there's a structural fascial continuity. Fascia is the connective tissue, the matrix that surrounds and envelops muscles, arteries, nerves, veins, connects to bones, ligaments, tendons, surrounds capsules, and even connects within the organs themselves. There's a fascial continuity. They now have a fascial congress, International Fascial Congress has been meeting the last 10 years or so, because it's become a hot topic in the world. Swedenborg was describing fascial continuity back in his day. He talks about fluid connections, a lot about blood, but he also talks about lymphatics, and he talks about cerebral spinal fluid in great detail, in some unusual ways that science is still not quite caught up with, but certain osteopathic applications very much use. And motion is fundamental throughout. He sees motion as being the activity that unites things. I like the concept of use and motion. They're different, but the idea of activity is what unites different things. So I'm getting a little bit vague, but the idea is the anatomic works that emphasize an animatory motion throughout the body that's governed by the motion of the brain, and there's a primary connecting presence and organizing life force throughout the body. Is this different than heroic medicine? Very different. Now, Swedenborg never developed any therapeutic application of these ideas. As he got very sophisticated, he then transitioned to theological works and left them behind. He still built on some of the ideas. He never developed a system of medicine or health. So I'm exposing some ideas that would be used later to do just that. I mentioned that already. The brain is surrounded by dural membranes, which is a type of fascial structure, and the dura itself has a little bit of stretch, but it's pretty tough. And the dura surrounds the brain and connects to the bones and the sutures that unite them. And he saw all this as evidence for motion taking place. He felt there's an animatory motion of the brain and central nervous system. It was transmitted by the dura, the covering. It was contiguous. It's a very nice the idea of contiguous things that are next to each other, but influencing each other, but not the same, not continuous. They're discrete structures. It was transmitted to the bones of the head, but also that the dura envelops the brain, entire spinal cord, and helps transmit this motion in a sheath fashion around the nerves out to all the vessels and connected to the fascia that surrounds and envelops everything too. So the neurofascial continuity is applied in animatory motion to all structures throughout the body. It's a lot of big words, but it's kind of a fascinating concept. He felt this continued all the way out to the finest little ends, and he talked about individual cells and what they would do. And that's before there was a sophisticated cell theory that existed. He felt this dura-fascial continuity was throughout the whole body. So he described the dura enveloping nerves that supply the pleura, which is what surrounds the lungs, supplies the pericardium, which is what surrounds the heart, supplies the peritoneum and the sphere of the rest of the body that surrounds the abdominal contents. So you have these continuous dural structures transmitting force and activity to organs and throughout the entire body, covering all the nerves, connecting to all muscles, sense organs, and viscera. So motion connects everything. Motion of the lungs, the heart, each has its own motion, but they're united under this harmonious activity, similar to breathing, but a little bit different from it. It's a more subtle activity. This is Swedenborg's model I'm talking about now. I'm about done with it. It gets pretty deep, I'm sorry, but I thought I'd just expose you to some ideas. So there's this brain motion, reciprocal motion of the dura that transmits this throughout the body. There's individual motion of certain bones that go with it. And you get a concept of spirituous fluid, which is, you have to read the book to get that. It's just too complicated to talk about. He felt there's a finest spirituous essence. This is his scientific works. He's trying to find the soul's presence in the body. He felt the spirituous essence was something that came out of the cells that form the cortex of the brain, the gray matter, to the center of the spinal cord. And this was a spirituous element. It had a fluid-like substance that then was transmitted into the cerebral spinal fluid and animated the cerebral spinal fluid and carried by that fluid along these nerve areas to the rest of the body. So it was a fluid continuity that was activated by some sort of force that helped unite soul and body together. Spirituous fluid doesn't exist in our anatomy books today, our physiology books. That's a concept he developed. It went into the circulatory system as well. He felt it and had all systems connected. And so there was a fluid aspect to his continuity as well as a fascial aspect. So these are paradigms that are kind of interesting. I'm just sort of skipping the stone across the water, just exposing different ideas. It was an inherently holistic paradigm. It integrates brain function motion. It integrates neurologic, skeletal, fascial, respiratory, cardiovascular systems into a single entity in the context of soul, mind, body as a single entity with a rhythmic component to it. So that's Swedenborg's model he developed in his scientific works, particularly the brain. And you may be familiar with some of his more theological works, but how that influenced A.T. Still, the founder of osteopathy? Well, he adopted some ideas that the body's a unit. Body, mind, and spirit form a single triunity, a single entity. He believed there was inherent wisdom and intelligence that was contained in the human body. The human body is a reflection of the divine wisdom of the Creator. This is A.T. Still I'm talking about, the founder of osteopathy. Structure and function, cause and effect. You can look at the structures and see function, much like Swedenborg is using, the methods Swedenborg used to determine some of his, to come with his ideas. A.T. Still talked about the important role of fluids in the body, including cerebral spinal fluid, blood, and lymphatic fluids. He talked a lot about the role of the artery, the role of the nerve, and the importance of the CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, for supplying vitality and health. He talked about a fascial unity of the body that's continuous, connecting the nervous system to the rest of the body, and part of it involved in neurofascial continuity. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? He doesn't mention Swedenborg, but he has ideas very similar to him. This all happened in the context of Still leaving behind organized medicine and organized religion at the same time to pursue his own unique paradigm of osteopathy. So here's a question. When Andrew Taylor Still declared osteopathy as something new, he was expelled from the church he belonged to. The Frontier Methodist Church said, "You're going to hell. You need to go away or repent and come back." Why would practicing a new form of drugless medicine with hands-on adjustments be a threat to the existing Protestant churches of the time? I wondered that. It never made sense to me. I mean, here's a guy who's a little different. Okay, he's not hurting anyone. Why are you feeling threatened by him? The answer is he was leading organized religion, and his paradigm was much bigger than just hands-on adjustments to help facilitate healing. So I mentioned the New England Immigrant Aid Company. They brought all these settlers down from the Northeast at a time when ideas were flourishing in the Northeast. Many were spiritualists, many were Swedenborgians, and to a lesser degree, Theosophy and New Thought came along later, probably influenced Still as well. So Still was influenced by all these things. One person that's fascinating is, one idea that's fascinating. Mesmerism, magnetic healing was very popular at the time. And as that spread, a new movement came soon afterwards called spiritualism that borrowed a lot of mesmerism. George Bush is a fascinating character. He was a new church minister. He's actually, I forget how it works, like the great grand-uncle of the older of the two George Bushes that we had as presidents. So there's a lineage there. He was a professor of ancient language, I believe. I don't have the details in front of me, but he was a very important man. He was very much an intellectual who came from outside the church, came in and was a huge player in increasing the public's exposure to new church doctrine and ideas. And he was very interested in mesmerism. He wrote a book, Mesmer and Swedenborg, or the relation of the developments of mesmerism to the doctrines and the disclosures of Swedenborg in 1847. He felt that when people were put in a mesmeric state, a hypnosis-type state, he felt that was evidence of a spiritual reality. And he said, if this all turns out to be a hoax, it doesn't take away from Swedenborg. If it turns out to be something meaningful, it could be evidence supporting Swedenborg's ideas. So he was out there exploring these new ideas. And when he did that, he came across a young man named Andrew Jackson Davis. And Andrew Jackson Davis borrowed heavily from Swedenborg. And I say borrowed to be polite. He plagiarized. He just co-opted huge parts of Swedenborg's ideas and claimed them as his own. But he was first introduced to the world by George Bush in his book. George Bush later said, you went too far, I don't endorse you, and retracted his support of Davis. But at that point, Andrew Jackson Davis became a very well-known magnetic healer who borrowed very heavily from Swedenborg's ideas. The Fox sisters were an interesting occurrence where these two sisters claimed to have, here's some knocking on their house at night. It was sort of a haunted house story. They ended up saying, there's a spirit in the house. Knock once for yes and twice for no. And they asked questions. It turned out someone had died in the house before. He was communicating them through a series of knocks, and the curtains and the windows rattled. But instead of just being a haunted house story, it caught the public attention. And Andrew Jackson Davis, who developed a whole philosophy called harmonial philosophy, which is based on Swedenborg's cosmology with some major editing, he actually endorsed that as saying, this is evidence of spirit contact. And not only that, I'll teach you how to do it yourselves. And he did. He taught how to do seances. He taught that there's a spiritual sun, which radiated divine love and wisdom to a spiritual reality, that there's degrees in the afterlife, where we all progress to eternity, that this life is a spiritual journey where our job is to put away sin and embrace what is healthy and good, and that, by the way, you contact spirits to show proof that that's there. So he knew Swedenborg really well. He ignored Swedenborg's advice, or Swedenborg's caution, do not contact spirits. This is a bad and dangerous thing, don't do it. He ignored that part of it. He also got rid of hell. There's just 7 stages in the afterlife. Instead of 3 degrees of heaven, 3 degrees of hell, and the world of spirits in between, there's just 7 degrees of continual progression. But so he made some major editorial changes. But the point is, he took a lot of Swedenborg's ideas, including his theory of the brain. He felt magnetic healing involved moving a magnetic energy through the body, much like a fluid that originated in the brain and had to be moved appropriately. He used some hands-on adjustments at times to do that. Most of the time it was other techniques. So he was a turning point to give a philosophy to something known as spiritualism. I knew nothing about spiritualism when I started my research. Turns out spiritualism was a huge movement, a major metaphysical, philosophical, and religious movement that had great meaning to many people. I thought spiritualism was some sort of gullible people that engaged in seance and were tricked by charlatans. Well, it did turn into that towards the end of the 1800s, but in the middle 1800s, there was over 2 million people that were participating in spiritualism. They talked about correspondence and influx. They talked about universal salvation. They felt spirit contact was evidence that there's a spiritual reality. Some thought it was a means of learning truth. They held Swedenborg as an icon and the first spiritualist. He was a hero. And they embraced much of Swedenborg's ideas, but clearly not all of them. So this is a means by which many Swedenborg's ideas were carried, but clearly edited and some deleted. That was happening at the same time as the new church was around, carrying a form of Swedenborgianism that was much more Swedenborg, not changed by any other mechanism like mesmerism. So you have all these intellectuals that were very abolitionists coming in. Well, spiritualism was very abolitionist. In fact, many abolitionists were spiritualists. The two happened to coincide in time and space. They all come down, still surrounded by them in Kansas. So he's also surrounded by Swedenborgians. There's Swedenborgians in his little town of Lawrence, which is the town that started right at that time to be a free state town. So there's actually new church sermons being given there. New church headquarters were set up nearby as well, Olivet, Kansas. It was supposed to be a headquarters for Western expansion of the new church. And that was set up very close by, just a few miles away. So he was exposed to Swedenborgians, spiritualists. So why was he thrown out of the Methodist Church when he proposed a drugless approach to medicine using hands-on healing to facilitate the body's natural ability to heal itself? Because he developed his approach as he left heroic medicine, he left organized religion. He had a paradigm that involved body, mind, spirit, and concepts such as universal salvation that were very opposed to the Protestant evangelical religion of his day. Now, he didn't teach that in his schools. That's what he went through himself. In the schools, he wasn't teaching religion. He was teaching a healing method. But his paradigm challenged organized religion of the frontier at that time. He embraced a Swedenborg-inspired cosmology while he rejected disease-focused medicine. This threatened organizations of his day, including medicine and religion. He left to develop a new science and philosophy of osteopathy. I'm just going to touch on something more with Cranial Concept. I'm just, again, skipping stones across the water. I love telling stories, people's stories. So William Garner Sutherland went to school when Still was still alive. He went to school in 1898 and graduated in 1900. He had an insight. He looked at the cranial sutures. The bones of the head had the sutures to connect them, but they're not straight lines. They're interdigitated and beveled in different ways in different places. And he looked at that and said, that's made for movement. Why would the bones of the skull move? And he said, I'm going to explore this. And over 40 years, he developed a concept called the Cranial Concept. He taught this to the profession in the 1940s, and he made 4 references to Swedenborg. These are little passing references. They are not major things that he did. Quiet little references. He met with Alfred Acton probably about 1943 at a study group in Morristown, New Jersey, led by the Lippincotts, who were very progressive students of his teaching. So I think he came across Swedenborg's ideas in the 1920s when he first started developing his ideas. But when Acton translated the Cerebrum, the two corresponded. There's more about that in the book. The history is interesting. Here's the concepts, the 5 components of the cranial concept. Do they sound familiar? There's an inherent motility of the brain and spinal cord. There's motion. There's a fluctuation of the cerebral spinal fluid. Swedenborg talked about a pulsation of the cerebral spinal fluid as the brain moves, so did the cerebral spinal fluid. He talked about mobility of intracranial, intraspinal membranes. That's the neural membranes connecting everything in a reciprocal fashion to brain activity. Sounds familiar, does it, from Swedenborg's works? He also said, number 4, there's articular mobility of the cranial bones. The bones actually can have this tiny motion. With practice, you can sense that in many people. He talked about a 5th item. The sacrum, the tailbone, had involuntary movement that's connected to that of the head. So the 5th item, Swedenborg didn't talk about that. But 1, 2, 3, 4 sounds a lot like Swedenborg's, the brain. He had a quote. Here's a quote he made in 1944. This is from Dr. Sutherland. Like Swedenborg, who studied anatomy 200 years ago in search of the soul, Dr. Andrew Taylor Still studied the handiwork of his maker, the human body. So it's kind of fun to find some references. I can say, yes, 1-to-1, he read his works and his ideas were influenced. He went on to say, if you become a mechanic of the cranial mechanism by correcting a cranial lesion, you then become the pharmacist. There is no end to this thought. It is not a new thought. Swedenborg 200 years ago said there's movement of the brain. Have we anything totally new? No. So osteopathy in the cranial field is a broad topic. I won't begin to be able to cover it. Just thought I'd let you know that it is taught in all the schools as a small piece of a course. So the people that really get into it, they take many, many, many more courses, many more hours. But they're all introduced to the concept and have a lived experience with it. It's tested on national boards. We have 3 sets of national board students all take, and again, as physicians to get a license. And craniosacral therapy is something that grew as a branch outside of the osteopathic profession. In the 1950s and 1970s, one of the major docs who studied this left the osteopathic profession and created his own institute. Literally, this is the Lecture Institute, and he taught craniosacral therapy. So you'll hear something called craniosacral therapy. It has roots in this, but it's kind of gone its own direction, often outside of the medical profession, body workers and therapists. So, I don't see this not too well. This is the book. There's whole sections on Swedenborg, his ideas, a summary of his scientific and theological ideas. Different movements that came along, such as Transcendentalism with Emerson, who was very much influenced by Swedenborg. Other concepts such as mesmerism and magnetic healing, how spiritualism developed as a fusion of Swedenborg's ideas and mesmerism, carried by Andrew Jackson Davis, who was the harmonial philosopher that became the underlying philosopher behind the spiritualist movement. How these ideas were all carried around still as he developed his ideas and left organized medicine. There's a lot more details about fluid, fascia, nerves, arteries, veins, particularly the appendices. Talks about Still's favorite biologist, Alfred Russel Wallace, who came up with the theory of evolution simultaneously and independently with Darwin. They corresponded, each coming up with the same ideas in parallel. And Wallace actually was very much enamored with spiritualism and Swedenborg and defended him. He saw evolution as in a context of a creator with a creation. Very much in favor of evolution, showing how it worked, survival of the fittest, and all that, but in a different context. I talk about some other metaphysical movements, New Thought and Theosophy, because they had some strands and influence still as well. I'm also talking about some other characters that have players in here I won't go into, but talking about the cranial concept and how similar to Swedenborg's concept of brain-body unity. And I even throw a little bit about the new church and what happened historically while osteopathy was developing, and how just playing the little things like the new church's interest in homeopathy. But this is not a book about homeopathy. It's a book about osteopathy, which is the foundation that would later become osteopathic medicine, which is the profession that exists today. So Swedenborg came up with these amazing ideas, many of them scientific and of course theological. Those ideas spread across the America of the 1800s in many movements. The new church was there all along, avidly publishing and translating these works that are available. Spiritualists spread them, so did other groups. Andrew Taylor still developed his approach in that context and very much was influenced by it. His student, William Garner Sutherland, developed osteopathy in the cranial field, a subset of that. They were geniuses. They developed a therapeutic method. Swedenborg did not, but they used Swedenborg's paradigms to develop their thinking. So it's fascinating to see how Swedenborg's ideas have affected other movements, and that's what this book is about. So if you're interested, they have it out there. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. My next speaker will be in 20 minutes, so I deliberately stopped in time. So a few people could have questions, everyone else can take a break and check out the books. There's lots of them out there.
You sure in 20 minutes?
Oh, I'm not sure. What is this
I
schedule?
thought it was 1 o'clock for...
Is it 1 o'clock?
12.
No, there's
12 o'clock.
I thought it was every hour.
Yes, it is.
10, 11, 12. Question?
Yes, you touched on it just,
Scientist, there's a
you
non-scientist.
touched on it at the very end. I know homeopathy was, Autonomic was developing in this country about the same time.
What was the time? What was right at the same time? Was Hahnemann doing his developing homeopathy as?
So the question is the timing about homeopathy, when did that take place? So Hahnemann's ideas were a little bit earlier in the century, earlier in the 1800s, and they were first developed in Germany, but then spread to this country. I don't have the dates in front of me, but many of the key players that first developed homeopathic medicine in the United States were New Church, very much New Church, several New Church ministers. And so even the Toffel and what's the major house? Toffel and Barricade, that's where he got these from. Those are names we know. Toffel translated some of Swedenborg's works. And so there were very influential Swedenborgians involved at the early homeopathic movement in this country, and they very much adopted some of the ideas of homeopathy, seeing them as consistent with Swedenborg's ideas. And homeopathy really flourished in the church, in the New Church movements. And back then there was no separation of general church or convention. It was before that split occurred, which was later, 1890s. So homeopathy was around as Still developed his ideas. Still did not adopt homeopathy because he didn't want people taking pills to solve problems. He was more focused on inherent healing within and using the hands to do that. So he didn't go that direction. The two were entirely parallel. I don't think they were antagonistic. I think they just happened to be in parallel with each other. Homeopathy being earlier. So by the time New Church people were exposed to Still's ideas, they were very much taken with homeopathy. So I think that's one reason why when George Bush saw the ideas of mesmerism and magnetic healing, he said, "This is so Swedenborgian. This just resonates. It must be evidence for Swedenborg's validity as a scientist and some of his theological ideas." Had he lived 100 years later and come across ideas of osteopathic medicine, he would have been even more gung-ho, because those actually were much more, had to do with Swedenborg's ideas than magnetic healing and mesmerism did. But at that point, we'd gone through a schism. The church had split. There was a very conservative element. I think part of what's really fascinating with this, spiritualism co-opted Swedenborg as one of their heroes and introduced him to the world, but not in 100% Swedenborgian fashion. So the New Church, which at first many people were very interested in magnetic healing. You look at all the articles published in New Church literature at that time in the 1840s. They were kind of curious about this. Even some dabbled in spiritualism. However, once they found out more of what it really was, they said that is not consistent with the New Church interpretation of Swedenborgianism. In fact, we're kind of upset that you're claiming Swedenborg when really you're not following what he said. So there was a reaction against it. In the 1940s and 50s, there was a huge interest within the New Church movement to be engaged in the world and explore new ideas, look for applications of Swedenborg science and theology in the world around us. By the 1890s, that was very different. They were focused more on reacting against offenses from movements that claimed Swedenborg that didn't really represent him in his entirety, his ideas in his entirety. So there was a reaction away from the secular world to be more internally focused with the academy movement and school systems and societies within the general church. So homeopathic medicine was established in the New Church. They had an inward focus. They went through a schism between convention and general church. And that's when osteopathy became known to the world. So that's part of my theory, is that the osteopathic medicine, had it been earlier in the 1840s, might have been widely accepted like homeopathy was. But instead it came later, and osteopathic medicine had its own crisis. In the 1920s, it came under a heavy attack from organized medicine and had to circle the wagons and improve some of their courses. And they introduced the teaching pharmacological therapy, because by then they had drugs that worked in the 1940s, 50s, as opposed to Calibel back in the 1840s. So osteopathy went through its whole evolution to become fully licensed and embrace some of the existing paradigms too. So New Church and osteopathic medicine kind of formed their own directions, homeopathy playing a role coincidentally with that. Not causing anything to happen, but homeopathy's a fascinating history. The ideas are really intriguing from a Swedenborgian point of view. Any other questions?
Do you use homeopathy at all in your practice?
Do I use homeopathy in my practice? I do not. I'm not trained in homeopathy, and a lot of what I do a lot of herbal nutritional medicine in my practice, but a lot of it's evidence-based, and so I understand how they're working, what they're doing. So I don't use homeopathy in my practice, because my practice is more osteopathically focused, osteopathic manipulative medicine and family medicine. Right now I just do osteopathic manipulative medicine, but I did family medicine for many years. So I don't use homeopathy in my practice. No. But I talk about it in the book. Question?
Can you give an example of using the manipulative medicine?
Sure. So an example, I liked my family practice. I was in a small town for many years, and it was in the deep south, and people didn't know what osteopathic medicine was. And they said, well, are you a chiropractor? No, sir, I'm not. You do adjustments. I do. And they'd come in a bad case of bronchitis, and they might have coughing and breathing hard. And when someone has an upper respiratory infection, there are many things that happen. If they're coughing lots, you can get strains of muscles and ribs that are restricted in motion. It also activates the autonomic nervous system, which is the nervous system that regulates things we don't think about, like digestion or heart rate. There's two parts to that. There's a sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic system goes on overdrive when you're sick. And when that happens, the fight or flight response of the autonomic nervous system. So someone who has a bronchitis, the sympathetic supply to the lungs is the upper thoracic region, segments T1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's where the nerve supply comes out to supply the lungs. And there's reflexes that travel back the same way. They're called viscosomatic reflexes. So when the lungs are inflamed and irritated, you can map out certain changes along the spine and the back that go along with that. They're autonomically mediated. They're neurologically mediated. So there's mechanical effects. Those ribs aren't working so well. They can be strains. There's neurologic continuity, and there's fluid aspects. They aren't mobilizing secretions as well as they should. They can get congested, the fluid accumulates in the lungs. So from an osteopathic manipulative medicine point of view, I may prescribe an antibiotic, I may not, depending if they need it. But I would use my hands to mobilize some of those restrictions, to free up the motion of the rib, to turn off some of the spasticity in those muscles that are tight, so now they can ventilate better, rib motion's improved, turn down some of those viscosomatic reflexes along the spine so they're not firing so much, so they get the nervous system's in a more calm state, and to help remove fluid that's accumulated. So sort of fluid, neurologic, mechanical model to solving a problem. I wouldn't say all that to the patient. I'd say, you're stuck here, I'm going to fix it. Okay. There's different ways to do that. And some might be very gentle positional releases, some might involve muscle contractions, some might be a snap, crackle, pop technique. But I would mobilize the ribs, get those segments working better, and treat the neck in other areas too. And if someone comes in like that with something new that's acute, that's easily treated. You can do it very quickly. So they leave going, I can take a better approach. Thanks, doc. I can breathe better. That spot don't hurt anymore. And that's very satisfying. Someone who's had chronic problems with lumbar spinal stenosis or nerve root impingement in the spine, that's lots of arthritis. Osteopathic manipulation can help that too. That often involves many treatments over time because it's been a process that's accumulated over time and it takes longer to treat. So it can be used in an acute setting for medical illnesses or strains and strains. It can be used in a chronic setting. It's nice to hit a home run and fix someone who walks in. Other times it's a chronic problem that involves multiple treatments over time. And very much used in conjunction with existing medicine. Perhaps physical therapy if they need that, or other interventions as appropriate. So it's not a separate alternative, it's just part of practicing medicine. I'm an idealist. I'm one of those 10-fingered osteopaths. That's the joke they called people that used it. So I use it in my practice all the time. Somebody else uses it very little, so it just depends who you see. That's a very good question. Any more questions? Great. Thanks much. Great books.